Hi, Ray. Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1101st New Social Environment. I'm Madison, a programs associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Ray Smith and Andrew Woolbright. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Ray Smith was born in Brownsville, Texas, and raised in central Mexico. Smith emerged in the 1980s and continues to produce exuberant paintings and sculptures characterized by an inimitable style and subject matter that reflect his bicultural American and Mexican heritage. Through the varied beings represented in his work, Smith reflects upon the complexities and absurdities of society, family, politics, culture, war, and the human condition. Artist, curator, and critic Andrew Woolbright is based in Brooklyn, New York, and is an MFA graduate from RISD in painting. Woolbright is the founder and director of the gallery Below Grand, located on the Lower East Side in New York. In addition to curating, he is an editor-at-large at the Brooklyn Rail, and he currently teaches at the School of Visual Arts and Pratt Institute. And now it is such a privilege to pass the mic over to Andrew to get our conversation going today. Thank you, Andrew.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So excited to get into this conversation with Ray, and also a little bit of a change of scenery for me. Excited to be tuning into this conversation from Ethan Cohen's amazing space, which I'll turn around. All of you who have not made it to the show, I hope you get a chance to. It's a stunning space and feels like an institutional show, like a real survey. So I hope you all get to make it. Ray, I can't wait to get into this conversation with you. So why don't we start though, because it has so much relationship to the work and the two shows happening. Where are you tuning in from? Can you talk to us about it?
I'm at what is known as La Tallera, which was Siqueiros' studio, where he painted the grand mural, which is the march of humanity
Hmm.
on Earth towards the cosmos. Okay, so I could tell you that this place is, instead of being a space, it's like a spaceship. Okay, it's like the wormhole between, the, let's say, the Mexican muralists in New York.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of artists from the US that, in a sense, participated in the making of this mural, his sort of masterpiece. And so the space was, he wanted it to be like a workshop in a sense, which was the place that he was working. It was a studio, but it was also a place that he wanted to they experimented with paints of all sorts. As a matter of fact, certain paints of Mexico were invented in this space.
Huh.
So there was he was very much involved in the alchemy of making paint. As you see this picture that you've got, those are like that. By this time, he was using billboards, that the same structures as billboards that would go on the exterior of the building that he was designing. And then, so basically, this place was, like a factory of sorts, but like a construction site too, so that flatbeds would come in here and flatbed trailers would come in, and they would pick up these gigantic panels, as the ones that you're looking at, and so it became a place of constant experimentation.
Well, I love I mean, it's incredibly fitting that we're getting to have this conversation here in New York and there. I mean, those massive tilted murals are just like stunning to look at. Can you walk us through? I feel like a lot of the conversation is going to be about the naming of the show, at least in the beginning,
Mhm.
and where that came from.
Well, Nepantla is, let's say, a novel means a place between one place and the other.
Mhm.
Okay, so say a river would typically be like a Nepantla, okay, because it would be from one shore to the other shore. But it also represents, life, which would be the space between birth and death. And so it's one of those words that gets attached to other words like Tlanepantla, which describes a particular river. So Nepantla, in a way, after this writer named Gloria Ansaldúa, who comes from the same place that I did, where I was born.
Hmm.
Okay, and she referred to that borderland, so to speak, between the edge of one culture and the edge of another one, as a particular sort of free space, like a no man's land, let's say, because you had multiple languages and multiple accents and multiple cultures, and it was I mean, what Carmack McCarthy called it, "No country for old men." So it's this space and where there's a particular kind of freedom because identity is constantly you're in a state of chameleon constantly.
Can we talk a little bit about what it was like for you as a young artist, kind of growing up on that borderland with all these different influences and experiences? I know, being here in this room, there are times where there's like Giotto being brought in, or like Philip Perlstein, the pictures generation in some ways, but then the Renaissance, also obviously Mexican artwork. Can you talk about if maybe some of the differences that you felt, or like the frictions or the oppositions of like the different types of art you were learning about and interested in?
Well, let's put it this way. I didn't really grow up in the border. I was just born there because my mother's family was from that area, and it was also the closest American hospital. And if we went and if she had me over there, I could be both American and Mexican.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and so but they already were living in Mexico City. My father came here in 1947, right after the war, and my mother is from the borderland, and so the reality is that she would come to Mexico City, quite often, because that was the closest metropolis in this culture that she would come to. And since she's Mexican and American, it was also the same. She was also coming here to. I mean, this was a real metropolis. This was like you were landing in the middle of another culture and a very cosmopolitan place, and Mexico City is, been rock and roll for 3,000 years. So it was the center of a major culture, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
So she loved coming to Mexico, and so did my grandparents. So did her parents. And so my father ends up coming shortly after the World War II, and it starts establishing a relationship between U.S. agro industry and the post World War II agro necessities that the world had. So Mexico was booming at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So I grew up really here. So say my first experiences with art were with Mexico. It was on this side. So it wasn't the by the time that I got to New York, I was already my 20s.
Mm-hmm.
And I moved to New York after the Mexico City earthquake of 2005. I'm sorry, of 1985, because our house had been damaged. So that we arrived in New York City pretty much like, no way home, so to speak.
One of the things I really enjoy about this show is the different examples of Nepantla that works on so many levels. I feel like I'm down here in the lower level, and it seems like there's personal traversal happening, but there's also like the traversal of this large work that we see right now that's combining the work of Guernica and Ang and also these images and symbols of the Olympics. Could you talk through, like, I mean, I guess what I'm really interested in is like you see this Nepantla truly as like things coming through and going out of this gateway of experience. And it's obviously scaled at like a mural size and done on panel for those of you who haven't seen it yet. Can you talk about like how you're thinking about the combination of these images?
You mean at that time or now? Because,
Well, let's start with when you made it, how you were thinking about it, what you were
okay, well,
spending.
what I was thinking about was, let's say, the biggest influence that I had, or that was influencing me, obviously, was muralism and, say, early 20th century Mexican art, and say the art sort of movement that happened after muralism was something called ruptura, which means like rupture. And basically the generation right above us was the one that had participated in that, which in a way was trying to create a distance with muralism, because by that time it had become the official art of Mexico as the way that they saw it. And my generation came into it looking back into that time, one generation removed, and we were seeing it as though like, but what are you guys breaking with? I mean, this stuff was great. And so we were sort of backpedaling into the period before that. And one of our biggest influences in school, in a way, was Frida Kahlo. This is before Frida Kahlo becomes, the symbol on all the bags and all that kind of stuff, because basically she was considered to be the wife of Diego Rivera. But we saw her as an artist that had a different type of narrative, and she was capable of sort of mixing in a lot more of the. I mean, her work is entirely personal. You know what I'm saying? It's autobiographical and it's personal. She's in it all the time, and so the idea was, okay, well, I'm not sure whether it was an idea all told, but her personal approach to things was something that we were very attracted to, and so why not blow it up to the scale of Diego Rivera? So it was okay. And in muralism, you have this incredible sort of like, it oscillates between political cartooning and propaganda, and then not propaganda, and it's constantly finding a way out of any particular definition. So it wasn't, they weren't following in any particular sense a linear projection of the avant-garde, as was being developed in Europe, even though they were a part of it, but they had found a kind of, I guess, a national language that would mix, everything from the conquest to the present. So
I'm sorry.
So say when they describe, Mexican modernism, well, they pyramids. My point. This wasn't like there was an architecture here thousands of years before anybody got here.
Yeah.
And everything was built on top of that. And the indigenous tribes actually built pyramids on top of the pyramids. So the recycling of all of those stones was constantly there. So to say, for instance, like Andre Breton came to Mexico and said that Mexico was the ultimate surrealist country. Well, yeah, but surrealism was here thousands of years before that, the mixing of animals and the notion of a cosmos or what was happening was not exactly related to the Christianity that was conquering Mexico.
Absolutely. Is this why I was really interested to hear that you kind of reject the term postmodernism in relationship to your work? When I first came in here, I made associations of like pastiche and irony in the way you're taking different aesthetics and styles and blending them together, and I thought it was a postmodern practice. But is this kind of why you have a hesitancy of describing the work in that way?
Well, let's put it this way. The very first time I ever read anything about or heard of postmodernism was Venturi's book on postmodernism and the architecture of Las Vegas and the mixing and all that. Well, yeah, but that's here. You got my point? In other words, it's all built that way.
Right.
So say Barragan was inspired by the lost cities of Mexico, let's say, the way that a neighborhood developed just ad hoc. Somebody would put your city planning was based on, okay, I'm going to build my house here and you build your house over there. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah. It's much deeper historical.
Okay. Sorry about that.
No, it's fine.
This place is a little cavernous and we've got irregular signal.
Well, let's pick up where we're at with this hesitancy.
Well, you asked about 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 postmodernism. I mean, it's just difficult for me to sort of identify where modernism starts and it
Yeah.
ends. It's also kind of like, when you're in this place, then it's difficult to sort of really apply all of the all of the ways that that Western civilization, if there is such a thing. Okay. How I connected. Are you seeing me now on the other one? Great. We're back on. Okay, this is
Yeah.
okay. So say I don't know what portion, because I obviously you had to go solo there for a bit.
I'd love to hear more about your Guernica piece on the Aang, because I mean, the other thing is like the other reason now knowing more about your process, how you're thinking about, what does postmodernism mean when you have centuries of buildings being built on top of each other? But also like it doesn't feel like just pastiche. Like I'm interested in the way you're using Picasso and the way you're using surrealism, piece to piece. I know it's different in each work, but how are you thinking about like appropriating the image of a Picasso painting here? Like what's
Okay,
the
well,
after?
so say I get to New York, right? I get to
Yeah.
New York in the early '80s and start sort of, I it just instantaneously I realized I was walking into my own soup just by chance, and so I started seeing the graffiti on the walls, and I realized that on the, let's say, that a construction site, they'd surround it with plywood and then come by and destroy it. So I wasn't used to the idea of the weapons of mass development, if you know what I'm saying, and the use of American tools and plywood and things like that, which was something that in a way was valued in a different way here in Mexico. As a matter of fact, most of the panels here that you see for the studies of the murals and all of that were actually wood made on new materials, which were either plywood or masonite or some other material that was hard, just like a wall. Okay, so running into that in New York City on the streets and everything in a way was like, and they're graffitiing on the walls, on those plywood walls. So I was just grabbing the plywood that was being thrown away and taking it up into my studio and turning my studio into, a plywood plastered room.
Hmm.
Okay. And of course, the wood was great because you could remove some of the paint. You know what I'm saying? And you could take things away from it. And there was already something there. So it was already like a found object, and you could bring it in, and it was cheap material. As a matter of fact, it was free. It was great.
Mm-hmm.
So then obviously I started associating myself and meeting a lot of these artists like Jean-Michel Basquiat and Kenny Scharf and Keith Haring. That was my generation in the United States. And then yes, at that particular moment, then you start realizing that something you grew up with was a language that was being developed at the time in New York City with your contemporaries. So there was a lot of bad ideas, which were like a good takeoff point. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like the idea of appropriation and copying somebody else's work. And so at one point, I had to make these paintings for a space here in Mexico, which was right next to the the school, the old school where Orozco had made these murals, and this was going to be in an old church that they were trying to restore, and Mike Bidlow had done a gigantic Guernica that he showed at Gagosian's gallery when he was only out in L.A. And I loved the idea of the bad idea that he had gone in. Well, it was a bad idea, but it was a great idea. To walk into the Museum of Modern Art, and produce the greatest hits,
Yeah.
and then decorate your apartment with them. Okay, I thought, well, that's a pretty good idea. I mean, a good bad idea, so sort of in between. And so in this particular case, there was the shift of government. There was a change of the presidency at the time, and it was the same party in a way that had been created at the time of the muralists was now about to take office again, and it had been pretty much a single party dictatorship for 80 years, and they were bringing in their new president through this convoluted kind of notion of the PRI, which was the title of that is Partido Revolucionario Institucional, which in of itself is a contradiction. You know, it's the institutionalized revolution party.
Right. Perpetual.
So this was the new president that was about to come in, and so I decided that I would make something titled Guerni Max. Okay, and it would be 3 large murals, one that described the past, the other one that described, let's say, the past, the present, and the future. So the painting that you're looking at was the future, but in it, it's got all of the elements of the past.
Right.
Okay, so say, just like in Mexico, when they create these institutions or companies or whatever, they add Mex to the tail end of it. You know, like Pemex, which is the petroleum company, or Jumex, which makes juice, you know, so it's Mexican juice, right? Or Mexican petroleum, or Mexican cement, or something like that. So you add Mex and it Mexicanizes all of it. Okay, so Guerni Mex, in a way, was a way of going into the painting of Picasso's and reinventing it somehow. Well, that's certainly a degree of irony, but also, you know, a new invention of the idea, because, you know, let's say the Guernica is a type of undoing, right? It's the image of a disaster, right, or a bombing, or an invasion, or, you know, conquest, whatever you want to talk. Okay, and so this, in a way, it was there was a lot of material to sort of work with in between, and then obviously muralism, and the fact that I was painting on wood, and the wood, in a way, I was treating it as though it was fresco. So, you know, you're instead of trying to build the paint on top of it to create that illusion, you actually are working on the material itself, and the material itself is showing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I love this process, and hope you all get a chance to see it up close, because in richly embedded material, like the body of the Ang painting becomes this kind of carnivalesque or harlequin body. Like you said, the president of Mexico is in the mouth of the running horse of Guernica. Like there's desire being cultivated, colonialized desire, but also the threat of war, the anxiety of encroaching things. And then, can you talk to us about the Olympic symbol in it? Is that how does that play?
Let's say the Olympics in Mexico, 1968, which I was there and, you know, witnessed it, and I saw all of the infrastructure that was being built so that Mexico could show a kind of like, you know, there was. They'd invented the terms of first world and third world and middle world, or whatever, and everybody had to sort of align with that post-war World War II alignment that was now being generated from the North, from the empire, right, and the global economy and the movement of goods. And so Mexico wanted to show a modernist face to all of that. So I watched 3 things being built towards that, which was the Museum of Modern Art in Mexico City, the Museum of Anthropology, the tail end of the university, and then the stadium, which was then also kind of designed by artists and architects. So say I grew up inside of the art of it, you know. So and that's basically, you know, what happens in this country is that you know, you're growing up inside of the culture, which is its art. Inside of it, you know what I mean? So you're all of those things were enormous influences with me as a child, because it gave me an entirely different perspective as to the way that let's say they treated art here, and the way then that, in a sense, connected to its very long history. But again, I kind of missed. I don't know if I answered your question, man.
No, I think you did. If we could move forward in the slides a little bit. I guess what I'm really old.
So the Olympics, obviously, let's say the Olympics was this kind of push towards modernism,
Hmm.
right? Or a push towards, uh, you know, let's say the Mexico wanted
Yeah.
in the game
And the
of that.
paint and the mural becomes kind of fraught with the suspicion of that movement, or like at least it's seeing every side of it, seems like, in a really interesting way.
Yeah, but you have to realize that also at the time that they were doing this, the Vietnam War was on.
Sure.
And so American kind of 1960s music was very accepted in Mexico. So you had stations that only dedicated themselves to, they had an hour of the Beatles, for instance, and then they had an hour of Creedence Clearwater Revival.
Mhm.
And on another level, then when you finally got to the Doors or Jimi Hendrix or all that kind of stuff, well, we had the drugs. So
Yeah.
everybody had, we had Castañeda too. So we knew the road, kind of, so to speak. So that's where that uh, kind of war protest in the United States against the war in Vietnam, a kind of anti-Americanism, right, in a sense, uh, was very welcome in Mexico, say, in a sort of odd, forsaken way.
Yeah, I mean, I really like, and I think that comes across very clearly, or it did when I was walking through the show of it feels like you've really embodied and kind of internalized the power of the signal of that incoming import, of like culture from America being kind of like shot through the airwaves and seeing it that way. And I'm wondering if like the one of the ways I really was affected by the show is it feels like it's trying to reverse that signal or play with that signal or complicate it in some ways. Like, do you feel
Well,
like you're deconstructing that kind of that idea of colonial import and trying to show that the passage is more fluid than that?
yeah, because basically we're in the city here that
Mm.
was where the conquistador Hernan Cortés built his palace, okay, which is just a few blocks away from where we're sitting, okay, and he also had taken his translator La Malinche, who was the she was the translator, the traitor. Both those words come from the same place, from the same source. You understand? So say she translated and she committed treason, I suppose, but she's also the mother of all Mexicans.
Hmm.
You got it. So you're already living in this mixture between the two of them, and the is the mother of all Mexicans. So so yeah, we live that. Let's say Mexico still lives that today. It's a living, breathing thing. There, even when I was teaching for a bit in the States, and everybody was trying to come up with, the other, or speaking of the other, I would tell my students, I'd say, you are the other. I mean, the rest of the world has gone through all of these different things, and so to compare 300 and some odd million, people on the planet that have created this new system of of that have created the new system of economics and all of this other kind of stuff because of enormous amounts of resources, where everyone's kind of like forced to follow the model.
Hmm.
You know what I mean? But in another sense, it was also like another conquest. So it's also very welcoming, let's say. So let's say Porfirio Diaz, who was the dictator during the revolution, uh, on his way out, said that that Mexico was doomed because it was so far from God and so close to the United States. so so there's a great love for the mechanics and the systemics, let's say the tools of the United States and all of that. But let's say there was this place is still very much a craft, so say even if they're building big towers here, there's still an enormous amount of craftsmanship. And if you go to any of the buildings that are being built right now in New York City, you're going to see that half the masons are Mexican.
Yeah, I mean, and genre critique is such an important kind of formal way of addressing that. I'm wondering if, to play off that idea, do you see yourself as the translator trader when you're making these paintings? And if so, are you translating or you trade? What are you a trader to, or what are you translating?
I don't really exactly think that you can separate the two.
Hmm.
You understand? So
Yeah,
if you contemplate the word, then you can understand why translation would be treason, right?
yeah,
Because you'd be spilling the beans on the secrets.
yeah.
Uh, and even when I had my first show in Mexico City, one of the critics wrote that my work was like having two big screens on the river,
Hmm.
one on each side of the border,
Hmm.
and they were both projecting each other's prejudices and cliches and all of the different things that they both thought of each other, even though there was a great deal of love about it. So the first things that I can remember as an experience of art was being inside of a building that had been built by an architect named Mario Pani that was right on the Reforma. And say in the hallways they had big mosaics, like mosaics that they'd commissioned certain artists to do. And Mario was a magnificent architect and a friend of my dad's, and his little brother, who was designing furniture and doing the interiors of these kind of futuristic hotels and everything, was the environment that I was growing up in. And my dad was fascinated with Mexican architecture, and loved Mexico deeply. And so he called me out onto the terrace of our apartment, and he picked me up. He says, "Look at this," and he picked me up so I could look over the banister. And there were these two big tractor trailers that had on top of it the Tlaloc, the rain god. Okay, and it was looking up. Okay, and there were and then behind that was a bunch of the indigenous people from where they'd ripped that sculpture out, and then they were taking it up to the new Museum of Anthropology. And so they put the thing in front of it, stood it up, which is not the way they had it. I mean, the incantation of this thing was that it look up at the sky if you wanted rains. But they stood it up to make it look, impressive, and standing right there still. And then we went to the inauguration of that, and mind-boggling, phenomenal piece of architecture with all of the different tribes of Mexico. And then at one point he picked me up again because I wanted to look inside this vase, this big vase that everybody was looking into, and inside were the bones of children. So how
Wow.
can I put it? I mean, the connections of that, and then flying to the United States. Say, so we'd fly from Mexico City to Houston when they finally had jets and things, and you'd land in Houston, and my God, Houston was the future, right? So in Mexico, they were contemplating the cosmos and ripping human beings' hearts out. And you land in Houston, and they're sending off rocket ships and ripping out people's hearts, right?
Yeah.
Transplanting people's hearts. So there was it was a completely fascinating way to sort of mix those two cultures. The one in all of its technology and all of its might, and all its boldly go to where no man has gone before sort of idea.
Yeah.
And whereas here in Mexico, you were living in a place that maybe you didn't want to go to the moon,
Yeah. Wow.
or you could contemplate the cosmos from sitting in front and staring up at the sky.
Well, I think I'm glad we're on this painting now. I think it gets to some of that really complicated layering that I think ultimately kind of ends in, like, being careful with the word, but ends in a kind of sublime. Like, what do you do with all of that? The cosmological, the religious, the spiritual, but also like the practical. And like this painting, it seems like it borrows from surrealism. It also might be very personal in some ways. It feels like it's navigating and using symbols in a very esoteric way that could be a spiritual thing, but it also is humorous. How are you thinking about this painting when it came? It feels like an important kind of another gateway or another Nepantla?
Well, they were like gateways, let's say, in a sense. I mean, I had been fortunate enough that I never had to conceive of doing anything else than, making the little drawings that I was doing when I was in kindergarten, and so but I was, being educated by by one of the guys that mixed paint in the studio for Cicadas. So my understanding of paint was from a powdered form, not from, running to pearl paint and buying. Not that I minded that, I loved it. But let's say I wasn't running to the store to go buy, tubes of Lefranc Bourgeois or something like that. I'd learned to make the paint from the alchemy itself, let's say, from where it started.
Yeah.
So in a way, the process itself, by being able to paint on the wood already had the grain to it. So somehow, let's say there's an image in there somewhere, so you're kind of like extracting it from the thing. And then yes, a lot of personal things were going into it. This is a painting that I made when my wife was about to have my eldest daughter.
Hmm.
And we ended up in San Antonio, and I had a space which was not much bigger than the painting. Say the biggest wall in the room was about the size of that. So again, I surrounded the room with these, in this case, they're hollow core doors, and I just encased myself inside of like a bull rink, let's say. And then you'd start from nowhere and start kind of like sort of just drawing it in there to try and figure out what you were going to find between the grains, the grain of the wood, whatever was going on at the time, and obviously the landscape that you're in at that time. This was done in Texas, in San Antonio, Texas, and where I was painting them, there were all these cypress trees for some reason. So they were there, and then the pregnancy of my wife, the Leda and the Swan, in a way. Um, you know, motherhood,
Yeah.
all of these things come into this one moment, and where and all of the joy and the anxiety of having a child.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly layered work. Like I love this like body as a knot or multiple bodies camouflaged together, or it's a body as a tautology or like a language. Like I like how the ring of the hand makes almost like a duck or like a rabbit duck. It's like the body is expressive and symbolic in different moments.
Yeah, well, that just comes from. I'm not going to say subconscious because it comes from like a meta conscious of some sort. It's kind of like you find a window into a nether world.
Mhm.
It's not about it, of course it's your own head, but it's also kind of trying to reach to uh, a hallucinogenic experience, which I had a lot in
Mhm.
Mexico, in Oaxaca and stuff. And there's a you know that in a sense teaches you, or you think, or whatever. I mean, whether it's a hallucination or not. I mean, reality is a hallucination. Let's start from there. Okay, so if you just can look between the cracks somehow, there's probably the hope of a night of an identity which isn't an identity in particular. It just happens to be the way things are.
Yeah. I mean, how much preparatory work went into like a painting like this, and how much are you responding to the surface, and how much of it is, I mean, I'm spanning this into two separate questions, so I want to keep them straight, but how much are you just dealing with the panel and finding the images you paint and being aware of your unconscious as you do it, and then also your hallucinogenic experiences, your dreams, do they have a strong relationship to your painting? Do you paint like those experiences look, or is there a disconnect?
I think that they come from the powerful experience that you actually have experimenting with that shit. So say
Mm.
we were experimenting with it on a combination of two things. One was obviously that there was American drug culture, right? And it went with the music. So you could drive down to Oaxaca listening to, I don't know, Fleetwood Mac or the Doors or whatever, and I don't know, doing some drugs and all of that. But there wasn't, when you finally got down to it and you were trying to do the Castañeda thing, you ran into the road that the Castañeda had gone on. Whether he was writing it in fiction or whether it was real, you were now in it. And hallucinogenic experiences with peyote or mushrooms and stuff like that became almost like a kind of a ritual in itself, because the way to get it was to go to Oaxaca and connect with the curanderas, which, I guess closest translation would be a witch, but they're not really witches. They're sorceresses of healing. So that connection of the women foraging through the forest, grabbing things that they could pick up and things like that. Well, they're our medicine.
Hmm. Huh. Can we shift?
So that in itself also, then then they would instruct you. They'd say, you've got to take this batch of mushrooms. You've got to take this batch of mushrooms. And then they would talk to you and they'd say certain things which maybe you were paying attention or you weren't. But once you started doing it, it all came alive. And now you were, whether or not it had been a suggestion by them as to where you were going to end up and where you were going, or, how you came out of the thing. And that still sticks to me really powerfully. I mean, it's I don't know whether there is such a thing as a divine source, but that in a sense is the closest I've come to understanding the cracks between reality.
Yeah, the thin veil.
The light that comes through the cracks of things like Leonard Cohen says. So I think we're crack dwellers.
I mean, and this is an incredible slide to have up. In regards to that, you have this massive sculpture segmented, but like it's segmented in a way that almost implies the concrete floor is like the ocean or water, or this thing is like swimming through it. In the background, you have a different type of segmentation, different parts of Guernica kind of truncated. When I first saw this, it was felt cinematic or an element of montage or maybe an exquisite corpse. But just hearing how you talk about that hallucinogenic experience of like you pick up on things and you put them together in your mind, or you miss things. Is that, I mean, how are you thinking about it? I guess it could be all of that.
Well, look, let's just say the sculptures that you're looking at are all coming from the same sheet of plywood, this laminated plywood. So I figured out that to make the sculpture lighter, you could hollow it out because you were cutting the thing, with a jigsaw, and so then every time you were making a cut, you were actually making several cuts. So say the sculpture on the left came out of the inside of the sculpture on the right. And the tail, which in a way does become like a sea monster or something like that. The tail on the one on the left comes out of the inside of the one on the right. Say so basically it's like a cochina doll. One sculpture comes out of the other. And so in a way, since you're cutting all of this with a jigsaw, and you might miss the direction or something like that, but you're going to continue to be based on the cut that you made before, it gives it a very organic shape, even though it's being made in a way by layering it the way that a 3D printer would layer something. Then so somehow the process itself gives you the image. You know what I'm saying? And then you've got to deal with the image the way the image comes out, rather than you packing it with all of your the sum total of all of your own prejudices. So I'm not trying to find myself in my work. I'm trying to lose myself. So that in that cancellation, you're kind of, I guess you are finding yourself by losing yourself. So the painting in the background came from another image of the Guernica, which I used again, that was based on the Guernica tapestry that was at the United Nations. Okay, and when Colin Powell came out in front of that painting or that tapestry, he started talking about how we were going to attack Iraq, start bombing Iraq because they had weapons of mass destruction. Okay, but he was standing in front of the Guernica, and then by the next time he showed up at the UN to continue his speech or continue his dialogue, they had covered the Guernica, the tapestry, so that, you know, obviously at the White House and the State Department, they thought, that's such a good idea that you'd be standing in front of a painting about, you know, the bombing of Guernica. Right. So get your stuff together. Let's go cover this thing up. So they covered it. And just, again, that was such since I'd already made the painting that's behind you, I thought, wow, that's what an idea that is. Okay. And then I realized that in a photograph that I had of that Guernica, the image, that the Guernica was reflecting itself on the floor of the UN. Huh. And so instead of trying to copy the image of the Guernica again, now I was trying to use the image that was on the floor of the UN, distorted by the marble. And, you know, by that time it was, you know, I was horsing around a lot with computers and image making on the, you know, trying to find things. And a couple of scientists, friends of mine, had given me plugins into Photoshop so that you could use certain things that are in Photoshop to sort of extract the image from like they do in an MRI. And I was able to extract something that looked like the Guernica, and I did that. And that was shown in Spain, and they loved it. You know, they said, okay, can you make us something else like this? I said, well, I don't know if I could distort the Guernica. Yeah. But then that's where the exquisite corpse idea came in. Is I thought, okay, if I can cut a bunch of panels and number the panels and just get somebody to help me to not know what I'm looking at and what's going to connect with what, you're going to end up with these images that are like an exquisite corpse, but let's say something that you played only by yourself. And so the moment that you assemble these things, you have to deal with them. They don't have to deal with you. And that, you know, you have to accept the outcome of it. And some of those that were the most unacceptable at the moment of completing them are the most, you know, they have a way of oscillating through time to become the most acceptable, right? So, you know, so say the beautiful and the sublime or the ugly or whatever are all born in the same church. And so you have to sort of deal with it rather than imposing, you know, whatever it is you're thinking onto the thing. Yeah. So say a different way to use the Guernica, but in this particular case, again, just like the other ones, it's something directly connected to a certain type of propaganda or a political cartoon or all of these other things, which were very much kind of, you know, they're in the okay column of anything you can do in Mexico. That's it. So so basically, what can I say? You know, it was the UN Guernica, but it also becomes the un-Guernica, right? So it's the undoing of the undoing.
Well, I think that kind of, I mean, it's just really impressive, the direct relationship and that mirroring relationship between the sculpture and the way you're sourcing images. It's like this deep image tunneling or material tunneling, and it's all very like monadic, you know. It's like the smallest part is like that cochina doll, like you said, that expands outwards. And the idea of like living inside of the Guernica painting is like so fascinating. Like, what if you only use those symbols to redo it and redo it and redo it until all these mise en abemes kind of count up to something, or it creates a different un-Guernica, like you said. It's a really interesting process.
Well, that was also a lot that was, let's say that process is also in a lot of Latin American literature of let's say, of Paz or Borges or Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And somehow, you know, the term magic surrealism, which I think many object to down here, because, you know, magic in relationship to what kind of magic are you talking about? But let's say Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who lived here and had a house here until he died. If you just listen to the town, you can find his narrative. In other words, you can see that what the guy actually had that was really attuned was an ear. You know, that he was just picking up what the people were saying and the stories they were talking about. And he was, you know, setting it up like kind of like town gossip of sorts.
Yeah.
So it's a telenovela too, you know, you're in it. You're not kind of like at a distance, you know, sort of like on the easel with your finger going up like this. I mean, you're inside of the thing somehow. And that is very much still today my experience of Mexico is that, you know, you kind of rejoice on the reality of things. You have a connection. You get a sense that you have a connection with the landscape that's entirely different than let's say when we're in New York. But in New York, you know, that moved to New York once our house was destroyed in Mexico, and we ended up in New York City just like any other migrant, you know, with no way home. They burnt the ships, couldn't get back, you know, and then there's so much in Mexican music that longs for you know, a return to someplace. And so say in that kind of sonnet, you're always trying to go back to something.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting in relation to this need for return, but then your ability specifically within your sculpture to deal with what is hollowed out as sculptural presence, to take like the negative space of the inside so seriously, find ways to make two things mirrored from the excavation of one becoming the externalized form of the other, I think is really, it feels like that is a formal communication of that desire to return in a really interesting way.
Well, I mean, let's put it this way. Once it sort of dawned on you that you could do it, you figured, okay, I think I got a home run here.
Yeah.
Because it was, you know, okay, so that, I mean, I'm lightening up the sculpture, but I'm producing 3 sculptures at one time, right? Or
Yeah.
so there, one is emerging from the next one and the next one and the next one in a way. So again, it goes back to the duck painting that you've got over there. It's something's being born out of something else.
Yeah.
It's going through the wormhole, right? And it's appearing in a different way. And this space here, the Tallera, in a way was, well, like I said, you know, once they wanted me to do a project here in 2017, and I could use the studio to make the show, but I opted not to move into the house because this is where Siqueiros lived, and he died. Okay, so basically, I could move into his house, but you know, it was almost like, okay, I would prefer to use the space like the staging ground, and respect his presence there, and then we'll lay it down on the ground. Like if you see the windows in the background, that's actually another floor that he would actually look down onto the murals. So, but you could stage the entire sort of piece on the ground and then look at it from the vantage point of those windows. So the whole process of walking around the space, and then the one room that he has over here, which is like literally, the best I could describe it is like a kind of portal, you know, like a wormhole. And I connected all different types of movies to this thing, like Men in Black, and like it was like, you know, and that it was the wormhole from here to the New York school too. So, and yet it had this incredible uniqueness because, say, a lot of the experimentation of the paints that Jackson Pollock and them were using by using house paints or car paints or things like that were being experimented in this space like that. Those are the panels around his mural. And so you could see a kind of, you know, you could see Jackson Pollock in that, but again, it you know, he didn't shy away from any of the figuration of it, or or what this is very difficult for me to sort of translate where he was getting these images or how they were emerging into his pieces. And obviously that heavily influenced let's say Jackson Pollock and Philip Guston and all of these people that were coming down here. As a matter of fact, I think that Rob Storr spent some time working here in the Tallera. So this was like a really dynamic place to be, and you could feel it. I mean, in other words, you get into the place and you can get a sense that there was something simultaneously grand and humble, if you know what I'm saying. So, yeah. And he wanted it to be an experimental space and where people would collaborate, and he was always working with a lot of people because he was making these enormous things, and he had riggers and painters and alchemists and all different types of stuff, and they were inventing their way through a dark cave, just sort of fiddling around with what they were going to be capable of finding in a darkness, let's say, or something. And yes, the place does get this sense, of something that it was probably his response also to the development of space travel and science and all the other kind of stuff that was going on just north of this country. So there was and he had been in New York and had taught, directly influenced the abstract expressionists, and he was known in New York City. And so this was your wormhole to whatever was going on up there.
Well, I mean, I want to these wormholes and this image tunneling and material tunneling that you're consistently doing. It makes you such an interesting artist. And I love that I am leaving this discussion still feeling that there's so many ways of knowing and understanding your work that we haven't even gotten to. Like there's a way of seeing these works and interpreting it through pictures generation. But now as you're talking, I'm realizing that, Jennifer Bartlett and this idea of like kind of system painting and the deep research and archiving you're doing. But then, technically and formally, they're so beautifully done too. There's so much, it isn't that kind of absence of authorship, like it's clearly your voice you're channeling through too. So all this to say, Ray, this is a truly phenomenal show. I hope everyone has a chance to come and see it while it's still up, and could listen to you talk about history and the history you bring along with you as you're using painting and sculpture to access it and tunnel through it is really an incredible project.
I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. So can I say one more thing about Jennifer Bartlett?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Please do.
To say, in that mushroom trip that I was telling you about up on Montalban in Oaxaca, which was like that was what they call a malongo, meaning that it was like a bad trip, but there is no such thing as a bad trip. Mm. Okay, but it was I stopped doing it after that. Let's put it this way. Okay, because I felt that we'd gotten where I was getting. And so I asked the shaman when I returned, and I asked him, I said, well, how is it that you can sort of tell about people, about, their future or their past? Or he said, well, he really couldn't see the future, but he could look down the river and he knew how to navigate the river. And so therefore he could tell you where the rocks were by the waves on the surface of the water. And I said, well, and this was right before I started heading back to New York. And so basically I already had this trip and where I was going to go to New York to see Jennifer Bartlett's Rhapsody painting. Okay, because the whole idea of the process was pretty interesting. So I asked him, I said, well, how is it that you can look? He says, well, just fix your sight in the kind of like in the river. As you're moving down the river, fix your sight on something. And then as you get closer to it, you'll start understanding it. So I began to sort of fix my sights that was one of them, was to go to New York to go see Jennifer Bartlett's paintings, that painting. And I saw her painting, and I had heard about this apartment that she had created and all of that. And then when I got home, my mother threw an Architectural Digest magazine at me and said, here's that woman that you went to go see her show, isn't it? And I went, yeah. And here is Jennifer in the chaise lounge in an apartment that had been designed by Richard Meyer, and it was, one of the lofts in Soho. And I immediately thought to myself, I said, someday I want to have an apartment like that one.
Huh.
And 10 years later, I walked into Jennifer's studio and I bought that apartment. So
interesting. Have we had this conversation before? I don't know. Are we all dreaming? Are we all hallucinating? That's very interesting. The closeness and proximity to Jennifer Bartlett that somehow came through.
Well, there you go. They say down here that God makes them and then they get together.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad we're participating in that. I can't think of a better way to conclude something that could go on much, much longer. And I hope this is the beginning of more conversations, Ray. But I want to give the opportunity to everyone in the room to get to ask you questions because there's got to be a lot. So thank you so much, Ray.
Absolutely. Thank you, Andrew. It's great.
Thank you, Ray and Andrew. This whole discussion has been so scintillating. Just a reminder for our audience, if you'd like to ask Ray a question, you can go ahead and use the link that we've dropped in the chat, and we'll go ahead and relay that to Ray and Andrew. But just to start the Q&A off, I have a question of my own. Ray, you've offered us so many rich influences on your work and your life, whether it's the muralists, Siqueiros, music, architecture, and I was curious, has literature also played a role in your influences? I know you mentioned Gabriel Garcia Marquez, but that seemed to be more in conversation with the Mexican experience in general. I'd love to hear more about any literary influence on your work.
A lot of literature. Octavio Paz lived in the same building that we lived in, for instance. The first people that wrote about my work here was a guy called Carlos Monsiváis, who I loved. Okay, and he's connected to he's one of the characters in Roberto Bolaños's Savage Detectives. Mm-hmm. So say again, all of that, let's say, or Juan Rulfo, for instance. Again, it's almost as though his literature was about living inside of the ruins, so to speak, right? So in other words, you're even if you build something new, it's already a ruin. so somehow there's that was a very heavy influence on me. And then discovering Cormac McCarthy, which again is from that borderland in a sense, so that was a very big influence on me. As far as a particular landscape, you go creating, or even, okay, Fernando Pessoa. Okay, Fernando Pessoa is the Portuguese poet of let's say, had created this magazine, a la Brooklyn Rail. and the magazine had all of these different writers and 3 different poets and all of it. And, there was one guy criticizing the other, and there were essays and all different types of stuff. So like there was like a really active, literary scene in Lisbon. And then it turns out that 25 years after his death, he makes the confession that he was all of the authors. So in a way, that kind of solved the issue as to, was I going to be Ray Smith, which was a name that in a sense my mother had invented for me to be El Gringo, so to speak, for my, American half, which was like anybody's name. And my Mexican birth certificate said that I was Raimundo Smith Iturria, because they use your maternal last name. So in a way that being 2 people at once, and then Fernando Pessoa being multiple writers at one time, each one with a very specific personality, permitted the Nepantla, if you know what I'm saying. So the landscape was a no man's land. And so in that, you could use any, you were going to be painting the landscape, so to speak, and all of the different characters in the landscape that each had different accents and different names or different personalities in all different, of two nationalities or multiple nationalities. So it was a much larger canvas to be able to paint into, if you know what I'm saying. I mean, now you were going to be treating both stylization, like you were going to be treating color, where you're going to pick green or red or whatever. It all falls into that no man's land, so that it's all just in one enormous grab bag. And certainly literature was very important, very important. It
It's so
still is today. Huh?
I was just going to say it's so interesting hearing about the fact that you were given two names at birth that served these multiple identities. Do you think that, I don't know, in life from the start, you had a better relationship to the flexibility of identity, that it did not have to be a single thing, you did not have to be a single ray?
Yeah. um, my mother, when I asked her, because she had also picked like a stage name, okay, and but it wasn't really a stage name when she was born. In Brownsville, most of the midwives were Mexican, so they were going to bring in, the entire sort of mythology of birth and everything into the picture. And so when my mother was born, she looked at the midwife, looked at my mother, and she said, "Oh, look, tiene pensamientos en los ojos." Okay. Well, pensamiento means two things. Pensamiento means thoughts, or on the other hand, it's a pansy, the flower. So when she was going to hand the baby to my grandmother, she said, "Mire, tiene pensamientos en los ojos." And then my grandmother, who did understand some Spanish, said, "Well, what is she thinking about? If she's got thoughts in her eyes, what is she thinking about?" And then she said, "No, the flower." And so mom, when she heard that story, she decided that she was going to drop whatever name was given to her, and she was going to be known as Pansy for the rest of her life.
And this was at your birth?
No, her birth, my
Oh, her
mother's birth.
own birth. Okay.
So she had adopted this name,
Hmm.
from the time that she was a baby, and then she was like Forrest Gump, that had problems with her legs and everything else. So they sent her off to learn to dance and things like that, so she could get use of her legs. And then she joined the Mickey Mouse Club, and she became Minnie Mouse. And so she had this whole sort of idea of like a stage persona. So in this dual name, she dropped. I was supposed to be Ray Smith Jr. That's what my name is, but my dad's name was Raymond Alvin Smith, so that's not exactly Junior. So I said, "So why did you pick Ray Smith instead of Raymond Alvin Smith?" And she said, "Well, Smith means like a forger, right? Like a metalsmith or a blacksmith or something like that." She said, "So you can make rays."
Wow. I
Sorry, it's my mom died last year, and you're making me remember all of these things that are kind of emotional still. So
Yeah,
that
I think that's beautiful, Ray. Thank you so much for sharing that with us.
sorry, I didn't think that I'd start crying on you, but I guess that's the way it goes.
Yeah, I
But
think
that's but basically that was I mean, so in a sense, you're kind of born in that place, and where anything can happen, and you have to sort of go with the flow. And I suppose that's what my mother was trying to do, but she was trying to get out of that borderland in a way and create Pansy.
yeah. Well, thank you so much, Ray, for sharing these stories, this look into your personal life as well as your artistic life. Um, on that note, um, we're gonna
Any other questions?
I think luckily you and Andrew had such an amazing conversation that covered so much that our audience was a little quiet because I think we got a lot of answers today. So thank you so much for that.
Well,
And
thank you so much
yeah, unless there's
for
anything else we
allowing
can.
me to share this.
No, thank you, Ray. Um, thank you both, Ray and Andrew. And thank you, Isaac from Ethan Cohen Gallery, for your support in preparing for today's event, as well as Laura from Ethan Cohen Gallery. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 24 years. A donation directly supports our writers, production staff, and operations. Support our work through the link in the chat. And join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Anne Agee, Gordon Knox, Charles Woodman, and Glenn Adamson to learn more about the Woodman Residency Foundation. And now you can turn on your microphones and say goodbye as you leave.
We love you, Raymundo.
Thank you so
We love you,
much.
Ray.
Thank you, Ray.
Good
Oh,
job,
so
man.
much.
Thank you,
Thank
Andrew.
you. Thank you, Ray.
Thank
Thank you,
Thank
Andrew.
you,
Thank
Andrew.
you, everybody, for joining us
Bye.
today.
Bye.